I've done a lot of traveling in my time, and with all the things that I've seen in airplanes and in airports, as many of us have, one of the strangest stories that I ever heard, and I saw this on the internet, so you never know if it's true, but we assume that it is because we saw it on the net, right? After staring long and hard out the window of a jet airliner, a passenger inquires of the flight attendant. He says, I've been looking for quite some time, but I just can't see them. Where are the lines between the states? Speaking of maps. Boundaries and borders are, in some ways, historically speaking, a sort of a quantitative Western conception that many kingdoms in the East were compelled to adopt for their own survival. This was sort of the characteristic of the nation state, to draw a line where this is mine and this is yours. And so this whole idea of progress was seen and expanding those borders further, making, like, I have more now than I had last year. And prior to that time, the borders, it was more like, when you passed from one nation into another, it was more like things just, sometimes you had to ask. Things just began to change. People were dressed a little differently. The food might be different. People's dialect might change. And you might just have to ask, am I now in the country of so-and-so? And they'll say, yeah or not yet. And that was just sort of how it was. But for many Asian cultures, and many cultures throughout the world, this was a new way of defining place by drawing a line around it. But a line or not, a sense of place is a primal kind of experience. Primal religions, when we talk about Native American religion, for example, are sometimes referred to as religions of place, because they are so tied to the location and the land that it has meaning, that it has connection in a very, very particular way. It's not just real estate, the way that Westerners, tended to see it. Particularly when the government came in and would pick up a tribe and say, okay, well, we need this land, so we're going to just give you some land that's just as good, so we're going to move you over here. But land is land, right? Well, no, that's not how it is. And so this is a primal thing. It's fundamental to our experience. And that's all that primal really means. It means being connected to the source of where one comes from. The things that are most basic to human experience. Even eating and drinking, is sharing. It's community. It's basic to who and what we are. It's a fundamental social arena. And so this primal quality of place is oftentimes experienced in this sort of a dialectic negotiation with the whole idea of space that is out there. We talk about our personal space, but we mean our place. But space is sort of ambiguous. It's just sort of out there that we're not sort of connected with. And we distinguish between those two things. And it has been said that places are centers of value that shape space. One of the most profound comments that I've heard in a long time, I was watching, a few years ago, a documentary about the moon landing in 1969. What a moment that was. But what I had never thought about before was what one of the astronauts had said, in talking about this and reflecting. He said, all of a sudden, on that date in July 20th, it's coming up here, right, of 1969, the moon was no longer simply a thing in space, but all of a sudden a place of experience, because we'd been there. It now had meaning as a location, instead of just a thing floating around out there. Furthermore, we can't help but experience this kind of this dialectic of place and space within our consciousness of time. And this is what we live in. We live in space and time, and place and time. So the distance between point A and point B, it's not just in miles, like it's this far away. It's not simply 100 miles away. It is also 2 hours away. So we are constantly in this dialectic where time and place are interwoven with each other. And so in light of all of this, what is this sacred place that we know as home? Now I have to go into my professor mode a little bit here. I can't help it. It's part of my identity. In 1958, the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote a remarkable book called The Poetics of Space. This is something of a classic now, and architecture students sometimes use it, but it is about the significance of place and location as things that are subjectively experienced within the self. And he uses, throughout the book, he uses the idea of the house and all of those places and niches and everything in a house that begin to have meaning for us. And he talks in great detail and using poetry to compare with it, talking about stairwells, closets, doorways, shelves, corners, things that we shape ourselves to. And that you know, and if you've lived in a house for a long time, you know what all of those places are. It's almost like the place, you know, it's you mold yourself to it. And then if you sell the house and move to another one, you have to start all over again, you know, with all of that. And sometimes that can be a very, very traumatic thing. Sometimes he describes this, what he calls the oniric house, meaning the house of our dreams and our daydreams and reveries. That it's not the real thing, but it's the one that we put together in our mind that has all of these places in it that have meaning for us. He calls this house the crypt of the house that we were born in, and that it's always with us. It's a place that we carry around, and it's always there. And so each of us has one of these oniric houses, a house of dream memory that is lost in sort of a shadow of the past. And so he would suggest that this is it's like an archetype. It's like a remnant that is so basic and so primal to our subjective experience that it shows itself in dreams and, you know, daydreams and night dreams and, you know, all kinds of different things that where we remember these spaces and are walking through them that lead to other kinds of things. Consider the phenomenon, and we've all been through this, when you go back to a place where you grew up, you know how everything is tiny? Yeah? Yeah, okay. I wasn't the only one, I hope, who was experiencing that. But that idea that everything seems little. And why is that? Well, it's not so, obviously things have not shrunken, but it's just that our world has become so much larger when at one time that was our world. I mean, I remember going back to Kirkwood, Missouri, which is it's a suburb of St. Louis. I had a backyard there on Manlin Drive that you could land an airplane in. You could land a jet airliner back there. I was sure of it. But I went back there, and that yard probably stretched maybe from here to the doors back there. How does that happen? Because my world of experience has increased so big, but that place remains this very, very special thing that is in the mind. And so this continues on in so many different ways in our homes. He uses, Bachelard in his book uses the image of the light in the window, for example, that we see, the hut in the forest with the light in the window, this solitude that is there, but representing a place and safety. It's, coming home late at night when I was, a youngster and everything, or had been out on a date and coming home when the porch light was on. I knew that the door was unlocked. When the porch light was off, I knew that I had done something wrong. But when it was on, it was welcome. Going out trick-or-treating for Halloween, when the porch light is on, you know that they are playing the game with us, and it's a safe place to go. I remember being that light, that beacon sitting in the window, because I got almost obsessed with in my young years with my father coming home from work, because he always got home at 6:30. And if he was the least bit late, I would just begin to worry and everything. And I became the light in that window, watching headlights coming down the street, saying, here it is, in this sort of a way. So we have these connections in this way, that I was the eye in the window. But when you leave it, how does one get back to it? The experience of return when one has left. And so this famous prodigal son story, I mean, if every person who was guilty of what this kid did was thrown out on the street, we have no families left. We've all been there and done that. But to me, one of the most interesting parts of the story that we often overlook, it's not the son that went away, it's the resentful son who is objecting to the fact that this boy is being welcomed back. Because he's the one who did everything right. He's the one who never had to deal with the dilemma of his own human ambiguity. The one who never had to face his own demons staring malevolently back at him from the mirror. The one who played it safe in a controlled and well-defined world in which everything is black and white and right and wrong, true and false. And yet, while having no less love for the sensible one, he reacts with utter joy to the renewal of a relationship that, as far as he is concerned, has always been there. And this is, of course, the message that Joshua is giving to his people in many ways as well, that this home you are returning to, you are returning because this may be a new place to you, that we're going to set up this covenant and this new thing in. But you have always been with God. You just didn't know it. We're not strangers, we are simply estranged. But to find that community. And this is what grace is all about. It is the grace that declares you have a home not in spite of, but because of your humanness. It is the grace that Joshua declares you may not know it yet, but you have come home to your place. I think many of us hold the notion that salvation and grace and enlightenment and maturity and all of these things are the cures for imperfection, but they're not. They are not the indications that we have made it somehow. But on the contrary, grace is something that is done to and with our experience of imperfection. We're never going to be perfect. But that's what gives grace its meaning. We are loved, not in spite of it, but because of it. I will continue to face ambiguities and dilemmas. I will continue to screw up. But grace should keep us honest with ourselves, because only then can we heal and renew and transform. So it's not a story of conditional forgiveness, but unconditional acceptance. And at the end of the day, I find myself thinking that virtually all of the world's religions are doing this or are trying to do this, where the home is the eternal God that dwells without, or the eternal spark that burns within. They are all peeling back the layers of the blind ego, and in some cases the dogma that would seek to deny this honesty, trying to find the way back home. And yet that journey, we go out and we return, it changes us in many ways. And when we talk about the mythic in mythology, they always talk about the journey of the hero going out and achieving a great end and then coming back. And how many movies and stories have been made, dealing with this idea that he has changed in some sort of a way, but bringing something great for the community. Thinking back, being a child of media and everything as well, one of the things that comes to my mind also is the show All in the Family, which we still watch in reruns, a lot of people do and everything. But, if you see that show in its entire, the entire design of how it was, you could see a circle that was taking place there. Because in the beginning, of course, it was almost like they were cartoons, that Archie was the complete bigot, the complete racist, the, completely closed-minded, very conservative, all of these kinds of things. And of course we have Michael on the other side, meathead, the complete liberal, radical, all of these things completely the opposite. And yet as the show continued, they became more and more and more amenable to one another. They began to blend. And yet the show came around full circle. If you remember in that show when Mike and Gloria, when he gets his first real teaching job, when that pivotal episode when they had to leave. It was so, it was one of these things, like these shows that, that the whole nation was watching when they left. And there were tears. And there was this moment that even though they never got along with each other, they had this moment of connection there that was so eternal. And they left, and the camera panned back then, and it's almost like it took you back to the beginning. And there were Archie and Edith sitting in those two iconic chairs in the middle of that stage with nobody else around. That's place, and that's connection. I think about my retirement coming up, where I'm going to be off to Thailand. I have a one-way ticket. That's scary. If retirement wasn't enough, I'm adding this other adventure onto the top of that, but this is where my wife is from. She was here for 30 years. But it's her turn now. And in a way, this is her returning home, but this is also my coming home too. It is my second home. Home is where the heart is. That's where she is right now. We have a place there, and I'm looking forward to rejoining with her. And this is place. A place is what you carry here, Home is where the heart is. Her time here changed her. My time in Thailand that I've had there changed me. And of course, I need to say something here also then about when we talk about coming home. It would not be complete if we don't say something about the veteran. The veteran's return to what? So many wonderful films were made throughout the years dealing with this. Some you may remember. I think Betty Davis called it the best movie that was ever made, the best film ever made, the best years of our lives in 1946, about the return of veterans after the war in Europe and the Pacific. The recovery, the reintegration that had to take place, both mentally and physically. Those dealing with the Vietnam experience, coming home in 1978, born on the 4th of July in 1989, dealing with the trauma, the experience of returning, being reintegrated into society again. One of the things that we focus on when I was teaching humanities at Johnson County Community College, when we talked about sculpture, I always talked about Maya Lin and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. A sculptural creation of genius that transcended the political. No flag waving, no heroic statues, simply a list of names on a wall. To enter into, to remember. Not the politics, but the experience of loss, the experience of memory, the experience of reintegration. For many, a place to which one could come home. And this, of course, applied to veteran and civilian alike, because as a nation, we had to make this return home as well. It becomes a cathartic journey into the depths of our individual and collective psyches. And yet there are many who are still on that journey, who are tumbling down almost a kind of a rabbit hole, trying still to find their ways home. And Vietnam is not such ancient experience. It is implicit in every current and conscious effort to welcome the veterans today. And they need to be welcomed. Regardless of one's politics, you take care of the veteran, you welcome the veteran home, that this is where they belong. And so perhaps in some way that previous phantom, if you will, must remain there in order to always remind us of that. And to wrap up here, I want to kind of turn this around the other way as well, because there was another side to this. In 2013, I was selected to be a member of a year-long grant-funded project whose purpose was to research and eventually produce scholarly work on the historical and cultural implications of the Chinese migration, or diaspora, if you will, in mainland Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. And while Thailand was a very, very familiar experience to me, I had never before encountered Thailand while focusing on this particular cultural context, and I had never been to Laos or Vietnam at all. And so quite aside from the agenda of the project, Vietnam was an extremely profound experience for me, to say the least. Among other places, I was in Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon, Da Nang, the extreme southern Mekong Delta, and Hanoi. And although I was a bit too young to have served there, this visit to Vietnam was a coming home, nevertheless, to face and deal with the cultural mythos that I had grown up with. But it is not just a matter of the American psyche, but I've come to believe most emphatically that the experience of the Vietnamese viewpoint is vital to the completion of that cyclical return. Were not the Vietnamese finally able to come home once the war was over? And socialist or not, their independence was long overdue and ultimately one of the success stories of Southeast Asia, but what a horrendous cost. How many wars? I mean, the French War, the American War, the ongoing economic and territorial issues with China that are going on. But for me, it was an experience that descended rapidly from the lofty abstraction of politics to the immediacy of shared memories, not only mine, but Vietnamese. One of our guides in Vietnam was a middle-aged woman, just a little bit younger than me, named Minh Hang. Currently an instructor in America, Hang grew up in Hanoi. And aside from our formally scheduled university meetings and lectures and all of this, we had ample time to explore and learn the culture on our own. And one hot and humid July afternoon, Hang and another colleague and myself were walking down a Hanoi street. And Hang suddenly realized where she was. She was within a block of her primary school, a place that, despite having been back to Hanoi to visit family numerous times, she apparently had not seen in years. And so on we trotted around the corner to the site which, to her delight, is still there. And Hang, I came to learn, is by nature not much of a smiler. She's a pretty serious person. But here was one of the occasions in which she smiled briefly as she remembered her time in primary school there and her kindergarten classmates. But as she reminisced with us there on that hot and busy street, the memories that she shared briefly were not all good ones. So later that evening, I felt compelled to press her for other details about this account and everything. And her story hit quite a psychic memory, for me as well, that I had not thought about for decades. Much of my experience in Southeast Asia overall has ended up in various written forms, academic and creative, some of it published, but none has been quite like this. There is a phrase that is very common in Southeast Asia today, and probably for ages in all countries down there, the phrase in English, same, same. Same, same, it means 6 of one, half dozen of the other. You hear it in bars and restaurants and marketplaces, a dozen other venues, but 6 of one, half dozen of the other, same thing, whatever. And so I close then with this prose poem, a final experience or expression of the experience of coming home for both Minh Hang and myself. In March of 1965, I was 10. I rode a birthday bicycle up and down 59th Terrace in Kansas City, Missouri. Be patient, children. The last day of school is only 3 months away, and then 2. In May of 1965, Minh Hang was 5. She and her kindergarten classmates were evacuated from the Bangor school in Hanoi to shelters and trenches far from the city for the next 4 years. Move quickly, children. The airplanes are 50 kilometers away. They're 30 kilometers away. Same, same. In the summer of 1965, my uncle came to visit our house. He had a big white flying helmet. He let me try it on one evening. In the summer of 1965, I didn't know anything about Hanoi. But my uncle did a little, because he was 50 kilometers away, and he was 30 kilometers away. In the summer of 1965, I don't think Minh Hang knew anything about Kansas City. But in 1969, she returned to her home, and she finally learned how to ride a bicycle. Same, same. In 2013, we both came home.